Hey everyone, have you ever wondered what it feels like to cradle an axe that ends lives and shatters souls? Because tonight, we're peeling back the shadowy hood of the medieval executioner to reveal the hidden agony and isolation behind every swing. You've seen gallows as gruesome spectacle, but beneath the public theater lies a haunting legacy of fear, stigma, and regret. We'll tread silent streets where children trembled at the whisper of your name and watch as a single miscalculation could turn justice into torture. Stay with me, because by the end you'll discover the one mistake that shattered even the executioner's own heart and changed history forever. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Tomorrow, come back and tell me which part of the story you fell asleep during. I'd really love to know. Now lower your lights. Maybe let a soft fan hum in the background and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: Born to a Dark Calling. The lantern's trembling glow revealed Aldrich's silhouette against rough stone walls in a hidden chamber beneath the family hovel outside the city walls. He knelt before a broad oak block, gripping the haft of his father's heavy executioner's axe, its cold metal pressed against his palms, insisting on a single truth: one clean stroke, one life ended. His breath came in ragged gasps and his heartbeat pulsed like a drum in his ears. Beyond the chamber's low ceiling, the city slumbered, unaware of the lesson unfolding in its shadow. On this night, under a sky thick with stars, Aldrich's destiny would be forged. From earliest memory he had known no other path. Born to Garin, the city's appointed executioner, Aldrich inherited a legacy of irrevocable finality. Fathers and sons in his bloodline had wielded the axe for generations, dispensing justice in service to crown and council, and in so doing courting fear and revulsion among their neighbors. Mothers shuttered windows at the family's passing, clutching children close. Market-goers crossed streets rather than meet the executioner's stare. Townsfolk whispered that proximity to the family brought shadow and misfortune. No school or choir would welcome the son of the man who sent condemned souls to death. Instead, Aldrich's education began beneath the world's bustle, by torchlight and moonlight, learning the motions that separated life from death. Tonight's lesson began with the placement of his hands along the axe's haft, his finger on the flat of the broad blade. An apprentice's first responsibility was precision. To learn the weight of the weapon, the balance of handle and head, and the trajectory of each swing. As father moved aside, Aldrich drew in a breath stiff with tension. He lifted the axe, felt the world narrow to blade and block. Moonlight filtered through a narrow slit in the wall, illuminating the splintered wood of countless previous lessons. Inhaling sharply, he brought the axe down. The reverberation of metal striking would send tremors through his arms, and sweat beaded at his temples. He exhaled and nodded, acknowledging his own trembling limbs. The night stretched on in that rhythm, lift, strike, exhale, until every tremor settled into muscle memory and newborn determination. That same power which forced Aldrich's arms to obey also forced his heart into a cold compartment where emotion had no place. His father's stern presence remained a constant reminder that mercy was forbidden. Each swing taught more than technique. It taught the burden he would bear each morning when the city summoned its executioner. The weight of responsibility eclipsed the weight of metal in his hands. As dawn approached, the chill in the chamber seeped into his bones, but sleep held no comfort. Dreams exposed him to phantom pleas, distorted faces, and the clang of medieval instruments. Awake again, he pressed his palms against the stone floor, forcing aching muscles and a heavier awakening into readiness. The ritual of living alongside death became familiar. Weeks passed, and the night drills hardened Aldrich's frame and dull-edged his compassion. He learned to steel his mind against the ghostly echo of a life slipping away under that same blade. Each lesson pressed him closer to becoming the instrument of law rather than a boy defined by loss and fear. Outside those stone walls, the city lived in routine ignorance. Bell towers tolled for vespers, smiths hammered steel, and farmers brought grain to market. Life bustled blind to the preparations in the family's hidden basement. The day Aldrich ascended the scaffold for the first time arrived without herald. The hood and cloak appeared like a shroud woven for the occasion. He felt the hood's fabric swallow his head and shoulders, cutting off all but 2 small circles of sight. Under that anonymity he became neither man nor myth, but something apart, a living embodiment of the law's final decree. The council met in ornate halls, robed in velvet and gold insignia, and pronounced sentence on a farmer accused of poaching the Lord's deer. The farmer's pleas drifted upstairs to Aldrich's ears, though from beneath the hood neither culprit nor executioner could meet eyes face to face. When Aldrich's boots touched the wooden platform, the air felt thinner, charged with anticipation. The blade's placement at his side seemed to hum with latent power. Below him the farmer knelt over the splintered oak block. Crowds gathered in the town square, a mixture of protesting widows, curious children, and merchants hawking bread, cheese, and ale. Execution day was spectacle and warning woven into one. Traders balanced trays of sweet cakes and mugs of frothy drink as though death were part of the fare. The farmer's wife wept behind the throng, her grief swallowed by the roar of onlookers. Aldrich inhaled that sound and carried it into his mind as he raised the axe. The strike was as swift as a falling star. The blade cut downward in a single arc, splitting wood and flesh alike. He heard the farmer's neck crack at the block's edge, felt the tremor through the haft. Silence followed. A thick, ringing hush settled over the crowd as crimson blossomed on the platform. Aldrich stepped back, letting the soldier's head roll free, before turning his gaze away from the crimson pool gathering at his boots. Water drained from his cloak as assistants carried away the limp body and head. The crowd's hush roared into applause and sighs, both relief and fascination mingling in the air. Aldrich removed the hood, breathing deep, tasting iron on his tongue. That night he returned to the hidden chamber and scrubbed the axe and block until they gleamed under the lantern's flicker. Blood dissolved into pink foam, then clear water, yet nothing removed the stain on his soul. At home, his mother watched from across the hearth, eyes hollow, her hands folded in her lap. No word passed between them. The house smelled of cold stone and damp straw. Outside, life song continued. Children playing, church bells ringing, merchants trading coin. Inside, Aldrich felt a vacuum of meaning, a silent question of whether life held anything beyond the next execution. Sleep offered no mercy. In dreams, he swung at drifting shadows, severing phantom limbs and hearing his own gasp as wood and flesh parted. He awoke with a start, heart pounding, the echo of his own execution cracking in his mind. He touched the hilt of the axe beside his bed, trying to still the tremor in his hands. Dawn light filtered through the window slit as he forced himself upright, forging a mental wall between nightmares and reality. The ritual would begin again this night, and the next, until his arms no longer shook and his heart no longer questioned. In the following weeks, 2 more sentences fell in his charge. A merchant convicted of forging coin and a midwife accused of witchcraft both faced the same final return to the block. No council member ever lingered at the scaffold to witness the act. To them, justice was an abstract ledger balanced by blood. To Aldrich, each life extinguished wedged itself deeper into his spirit, a coal beneath the skin. Yet he forced himself to move with ruthless efficiency. The cloak and hood had become familiar armor, shielding him from remorse, or so he hoped. One midwinter dawn, as frost glazed the chapel spire, Garin paused axe placement in its cradle and laid a heavy hand on Aldrich's shoulder. Neither spoke of pride nor regret. The old man's gaze held something unspoken, an echo of the memories he must carry too. Aldrich nodded at the silent gesture and turned away. He thought of the midwife's silent tears, the merchant's trembling hands, and the families left shattered. He felt their absence like empty rooms scattered throughout his mind. Yet in that hollow his resolve found shape. Life must end so the law could live. If empathy was forbidden, he would at least spare the condemned prolonged agony. Precision became his vow, ensuring each death was swift and final. His skill would not become showmanship, but a merciful end to suffering inflicted by societal decree. He would bear the burden without cruelty, the instrument without malice, even as the city demanded blood. That night, beneath a sky smeared with stars, Aldrich descended to the hidden chamber for yet another round of drills. Each swing refined his technique and tempered his heart. With muscle memory guiding the axe's arc, he focused on the feel of balanced steel rather than the weight of his legacy. In the echo of each crack against the wooden block, he heard the low refrain of his life's calling. To live among death and bear the axe's burden with stubborn resolve. In the days to come, Aldrich would walk the cobblestones to the scaffold many more times. He would don the hood and cloak, bite back the horror, and swing the axe with unflinching form. But he would also carry within him the faces of the fallen. Farmers, merchants, midwives, and the knowledge that each life mattered. In that tension between duty and memory, he found a semblance of purpose. To bring justice swiftly, to offer mercy in the only way he could, and to honor the weight of every life held in his hands. And so the boy born into blood learned how to live alongside death. Chapter 2. The Stench of the Scaffold. The gallows creaked in the morning breeze like an old ship adrift in harbor. Ropes swayed gently, each strand frayed from countless lives ended, and the wooden beams groaned under their burden. Aldrich stood at the base of the scaffold, staring upward. He had been summoned at first light, the message scrawled hastily in wax and soot. Another sentence, another public display, another soul placed under the executioner's hand. He adjusted the weight of his hood beneath his cloak. The wool scratched at his neck, still damp from the mist. His fingers traced the familiar edges of the axe hanging at his side. But today there would be no axe. The method, decided by magistrates who would never set foot on a scaffold, was hanging. Rough voices echoed from the square. Vendors rolled their carts into place. 2 boys carried baskets of steaming bread through a thinning fog. Farther off, a drunk weaved between stalls, laughing to himself. Life bustled in the shadow of death, and no one seemed to pause at the contradiction. The condemned was brought forth under guard. An old woman hunched like a crow. Her eyes darted in every direction, sharp and fearful. Her hair was white, wild, and matted with filth. She had been accused of poisoning a noble's livestock, and though she pleaded for mercy, the courts had shown none. Rumor called her a witch. Some claimed she had spoken with ravens or cursed a bishop's niece. The truth no longer mattered. Aldrich helped her up the steps. Her hand trembled in his as she climbed. He smelled urine and dried herbs. Her bare feet slapped the planks. The crowd began to stir below. Hushed voices gave way to jeers. A man called for fire. A woman shouted for justice. Somewhere a baby wailed. The platform was slick with dew. Aldrich tied the rope slowly, methodically. The knot was everything. Poor knot meant strangulation. A good knot meant the neck would snap. The difference was often a matter of seconds, yet those seconds could feel eternal when a body swung from the noose. The woman turned to him. Her eyes were not pleading. They were tired. She stood still as he slipped the loop over her head and tightened it beneath her chin. The final words read by the bailiff passed through the morning like dust in the wind. When the lever dropped and the trapdoor opened, her feet vanished in an instant. A sickening crack followed. Then silence. The crowd stood frozen. Even the hawkers stopped. Aldrich stared at her swaying form. She had not struggled. Her death had been clean. Still, a shiver ran through him. He stepped back. The rope creaked overhead like a grieving door. Later that afternoon, the body was cut down and buried outside the church walls. No priest attended. No hymns were sung. Just a shallow grave and a pile of stones. Aldrich helped lower her into the ground. The grave digger avoided his eyes. No one spoke. At home, the smell followed him. It clung to his clothes, his skin, even his breath. The scent of rope and sweat and that brief, final release of the human body at death. He soaked his hands in vinegar and lime water, but it did nothing. When he sat by the fire, the smell lingered in his nose like a memory that refused to fade. His mother tried to speak with him. Her voice was soft, but he could not listen. He felt carved hollow. He went to the woods that evening and sat among the trees until the last light vanished. The stars blinked above, distant and uncaring. Somewhere nearby, an owl called out. He envied its detachment. The next execution came only 3 days later. This time it was 2 men, robbers, brothers by blood. Their sentence was the wheel. Aldrich's stomach clenched when he heard the verdict. The wheel was not swift. It was designed for suffering. The body was lashed to a large wooden cartwheel, limbs spread. Iron bars were used to smash bones one by one, arms, legs, ribs. The condemned remained alive, if possible, to feel every break. Death came slowly, often through shock or suffocation. He considered refusing, just walking away. But he knew what would happen if he did. The city would call him a coward. The council would choose another. His family's name would fall into disgrace. His father's legacy, such as it was, would be spat on, and whoever took his place might be worse, less careful, less merciful. So he prepared. The day was overcast, windless, and gray. The square filled early, more so than before. People wanted to see the wheel. It was rare. A performance. Children sat on shoulders. Women clutched prayer beads. Men leaned forward in silent anticipation. The two brothers were brought forward. They were young, no more than 25. One glared at the crowd, defiant. The other wept. Aldrich met the defiant one's eyes. There was no apology there, only hatred. When the man was tied to the wheel, he spat at the priest, offering final words. Aldrich took a breath and raised the bar. The first strike shattered the shin. The bone caved beneath the skin. The man screamed. The crowd gasped. Aldrich struck again, the other leg, then the arms, the chest. The cries continued until they stopped, replaced by a rasping wheeze. The man stared upward, mouth open but silent. The second brother begged for it to be quick. Aldrich did what he could. He struck fast, precise. He avoided the spine until the end. When it was over, he turned away from the mess and climbed down from the scaffold without a word. He vomited in an alleyway behind a butcher's stall. His knees buckled. The bile burned his throat. He felt a hand on his back. It was the priest, silent, offering only a cup of water. Aldrich drank. The water tasted like ash. That evening he sat by the fire again, but this time he wept. Not from guilt, not from pity, from exhaustion, from the knowing that it would happen again. The next morning, the baker would nod to him in passing, pretending not to notice the dark smudges beneath his eyes. Children would skip rope outside the chapel. The world would keep turning, but Aldrich's heart felt as if it were slowing, sinking. Weeks passed. More executions, some by axe, some by rope. A thief, a heretic, a man who stabbed a priest, another who defiled a church bell. Each one a story, each one a judgment. Some showed regret, some cursed until the end. But in the end, they all died the same, beneath his hand, beneath his eyes. The scaffold became a place of ritual. Aldrich learned to move like clockwork. Tie the rope, measure the drop, clean the axe, wipe the blood, bury the dead. Repeat, each action mechanical, each breath deliberate. But the toll grew heavier. One winter morning, a boy was brought forward, no older than 16, caught stealing silver chalices from the bishop's vault. The council, pressed by public anger, sentenced him to hanging. Aldrich pleaded privately with the magistrate. He asked for leniency, for banishment, even for branding, but the judge waved him off. The law was the law. The boy's knees buckled on the scaffold. Aldrich steadied him. He whispered something. Aldrich didn't hear it. He couldn't. He didn't want to. He slipped the rope over the boy's head and stepped back. When the trap fell, the boy didn't die clean. The knot slipped. His legs kicked. His arms thrashed. The rope twisted. Took nearly a minute. The crowd watched in horrified silence. One woman turned away, clutching her child. A man crossed himself. A priest muttered prayers too late. Aldrich stood still, hands shaking. That night, he buried the boy himself, alone in the frost. He placed a small stone at the head of the grave and said nothing. just stood there until the candle in his hand burned down to the base. He did not sleep that night, nor the next. Over time, he began to change. He spoke less. He ate only what he needed. He stopped going to the market. He avoided mirrors. In his dreams, the scaffold grew taller. The ropes multiplied. The faces blurred. One day, while walking near the city wall, he saw a group of children playing near a stream. One boy, maybe 10, turned and called to the others. His words stung. "There goes the hangman." Aldrich kept walking, his boots crunching frost. Even the innocent knew what he was now. A shadow. A hand with no heart. He returned home and sat in silence as the fire crackled low. The axe leaned against the hearth. The hood lay folded on the stool. He stared at them both. He understood then. It was not just death he carried. It was memory, and memory, like rope, frays under too much weight. Chapter 3. The Weight of a Living Curse. The midsummer sun clung to the sky longer than it should have. Its heat poured down like judgment, baking the mud streets into cracked clay and thickening the air with the stench of animals and sweat. Aldrich moved slowly through the outskirts of the city, hood lowered, cloak tucked under one arm. He avoided the main roads now. His route weaved between barns and hedgerows, always just out of sight, just beneath notice. The townspeople still recognized him, even in plain clothing. Some stared and turned away. Others spat. One child once crossed himself at the sight of Aldrich's face, whispering something about devils walking among men. It was not the violence that ruined him. It was not the axe nor the hangman's knot. It was what came after. The years had wrapped his name in shadow. His neighbors recoiled when he passed. Market stalls refused to sell to him unless coins were left on the table without words. Children fled behind their mothers. At church, the pews around him sat empty. The priest always found a reason to end Mass early when Aldrich walked in. Executioners were necessary, but they were not welcome. They were both feared and despised. He knew that now as clearly as the blade he sharpened each week. He could be the cleanest, kindest hand of justice in the land, but it did not matter. People believed his soul was blackened. His presence polluted wells. His shadow could cause miscarriages. His breath could sour milk. Even rain that fell upon his roof might carry sickness to those who touched the runoff. He had seen his father suffer it too. Garin, broad-shouldered and solemn, had learned to ignore the whispers. He had taught Aldrich to keep his eyes forward and his voice low. But even Garin had broken sometimes. On cold nights, when the wind howled against the thatched roof and the fire crackled low, Aldrich had once seen his father kneel before the axe and whisper into its metal. He had whispered to it like it was the only thing in the world that could understand. Now Aldrich understood. On the morning of the next execution, he woke before the sun. A servant of the city had come the night before with a sealed scroll and a hurried explanation. This one was different. A nobleman's son had murdered a stable boy in a drunken rage, and the court, under immense pressure, had handed down a sentence of beheading. The family had protested. Money had changed hands. But in the end, justice had to be seen. The gallows were not enough for this. The city wanted ceremony. Aldrich arrived in the square with a growing sense of unease. Wooden stands had been erected, and garlands hung limp in the heat. A string quartet played softly under a red canopy. Nobles in silks and furs gathered in the shade, sipping from goblets. Servants whispered and fanned their masters. The condemned stood behind the platform, bound and pale, his tunic torn at the sleeve. He was barely 20. His lip quivered as Aldrich approached. The boy's father, a minor lord with red rings under his eyes, stood nearby, staring into the distance. His gaze never met Aldrich's. Not once. Aldrich prepared the platform. The block was newly built, polished and carved with decorative trim. The axe was fresh from the smithy, its edge gleaming in the light. There was no hood today. The council had insisted the executioner's face be visible. They said it made the ritual more honest. As the trumpets sounded, Aldrich guided the noble's son onto the platform. The boy stumbled but didn't resist. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His knees buckled when he saw the axe. Aldrich steadied him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, one full of terror, the other emptied by years. The crowd fell silent as Aldrich raised the axe. The edge glinted one final time. With a practiced swing, he brought it down. The head fell cleanly. The boy's body slumped sideways, blood pooling at the base of the block. Someone in the noble circle gasped. A woman fainted, but most of them remained stoic, as if they were watching a play conclude. The body was carried away on a silken stretcher. Later, the nobleman approached Aldrich as he cleaned the blade behind the platform. His voice was cold, tight. He handed Aldrich a purse of gold, ordered by the court, he said. He dropped it on the ground, not into Aldrich's hands. Then he turned and walked away. Aldrich left the square with the weight of that gold pulling on his belt like an anchor. That night he dreamt of the boy, not of the execution itself, but of the moments just before. The shaking lip, the silent plea, the face of someone still young enough to believe in mercy. When he woke, he left the house and wandered toward the cathedral. The great bells tolled above, their iron voices booming through the dawn. He sat near the stone steps and waited. People passed him as they entered. None greeted him. Some walked around him in wide arcs. A mother drew her child closer as they approached. The child pointed at Aldrich. The mother shook her head and whispered that it was the cursed man. He left before the sermon began. Back home, Aldrich found his hands trembling more than usual. He tried to light the fire but dropped the flint twice. When he finally succeeded, the flames flickered like a heartbeat. He stared into them, motionless, until night fell again. In the weeks that followed, no executions were ordered. A strange silence settled over the town. Aldrich tried to fill the days with labor. He chopped wood, cleaned tools, mended a fence that no longer had livestock behind it. But everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. Silent eyes, watching, waiting. One afternoon, he passed two young men in the market. As he walked by, they muttered beneath their breath. One of them made a gesture, something to ward off evil. Aldrich did not react, but when he turned the corner, his chest tightened. Not in anger, but in despair. He returned to the small shed behind his house, where his father had once kept old tools. The place had not been opened in years. Dust coated everything. Cobwebs clung to the corners. He sat inside on an overturned crate and stared at the wall. He stayed there for hours. At one point, he began to speak aloud, though no one was listening. He spoke to the wood, to the tools, to the memory of Garin. He asked how long it would last. How many more years until the name Aldrich meant nothing? Until his hands could be used for something else. Anything else? No answer came. The next morning, he found a chicken nailed to his door. Its wings were broken, blood crusted across its feathers. A parchment had been tucked under its wing, scrawled in rough charcoal. The message was simple: leave. He stood staring at the bird for a long time. He removed it without comment, burned it behind the house, and washed the blood from his doorstep. But that night he did not sleep. Every sound outside the cottage made him reach for the blade near the hearth. 3 days later, a man arrived at his door, a stranger, dressed plainly but with confidence. He said he came from the western provinces. He had heard of Aldrich. His town needed someone with experience. Executions had become too frequent. No one wanted the job. They would offer coin, place to live, seclusion. Aldrich said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded. He packed his things that night. Only the essentials. He left behind the old axe, the training block, the worn hood. He did not want to take those ghosts with him. At dawn, he walked out of the city. No one saw him leave. The road stretched westward, dusty and unkind. Fields gave way to low hills. Forests crept in along the edges. Birds called out from hidden branches. For the first time in years, no one watched him. No one whispered. No one pointed. But still the weight followed. Even surrounded by nature, he felt it in his spine, in his breath, in his thoughts. He had done his duty, carried out sentences passed by others, delivered death not for pleasure, but for order. And still he was hated. Still he was alone. By the time he reached the new town, the sun was setting. A modest village, clustered around a stone church and a winding river. Smoke curled from chimneys. A dog barked. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. He met with the town magistrate that night. The man thanked him, offered lodging, gave him a list of names already awaiting justice. Aldrich nodded, took the keys to the cottage and walked away. He found the house at the edge of the village. Small, simple, with a patch of garden and a broken fence. He stepped inside, set down his bag, and closed the door. There was silence. For now, at least, he would work. He would do what he was brought here to do. But the curse had followed. Not a curse of magic, not some dark charm, but the simple truth that no one escapes what they carry. And Aldrich carried death. Chapter 4: Blood Runs in the Family. There was an eerie stillness in the stone cottage when Aldrich awoke. The birds outside had not yet begun their morning calls. The fire in the hearth had long since died out, leaving behind only a nest of ash and cold embers. He sat up slowly, stiff from sleep, and listened. Beyond the walls of his new home, the village still slumbered. No footsteps on the road, no carts groaning under weight, no shouting farmers or bleating livestock. Only silence, thick and unmoving, as if the world had been paused for a moment and forgotten. This new village was different. It was smaller, more cautious. People here didn't spit at him in the streets or hang dead animals on his door. They simply kept their distance. They nodded when they had to. They lowered their eyes. When Aldrich passed, a space opened around him as if carved by an invisible hand. Not from hatred, perhaps, but from inherited fear. His reputation had reached even this far. the executioner who had served under 3 kings, the man who had taken noble heads and bandits alike. They did not know his face, but they knew his shadow. The magistrate had given him a list when he arrived. 5 names. 5 people already sentenced to death. Crimes ranging from theft and murder to the stabbing of a landowner during a dispute over grazing rights. The court had waited for Aldrich's arrival before proceeding. It was a grim welcome, but a necessary one. By the 3rd week, Aldrich had executed 3 of the 5. There was no crowd here, no raised platforms.
No ceremonial robes.
The executions were carried out behind the town hall, between dawn and breakfast, with only the magistrate and a single priest in attendance. The bodies were taken away in carts before the sun cleared the hills. Quiet justice, they called it. Merciful, they believed. But Aldrich knew there was no mercy in secrecy, only avoidance. He began to keep records in a small leather-bound book, not of names or crimes, but of thoughts, of feelings, of the slow erosion of his soul. He wrote about how his hands shook less with each execution, how his stomach no longer turned, how he felt more when slicing bread than severing heads. He feared this, but he feared the alternative more, to feel everything would crush him. One night, as rain tapped softly against the cottage roof, Aldrich stared into the fire and remembered his father's hands. They were strong, worn, stained with soot and blood, but it was the way they trembled when he held his son that stayed with Aldrich. Garin had not spoken often, but when he did, his words were heavy with weariness. He had once told Aldrich that executioners did not die of age. They died of weight, the weight of every name, every final breath, every scream that echoed in the corners of the mind. Aldrich had scoffed at the time. He had been younger then, arrogant. He thought himself immune to the decay. But now he knew. The weight was real, and it settled deeper with each passing year. One foggy morning, a boy arrived at Aldrich's door, no older than 10. Covered in soot and rain, he held out a folded note with shaking fingers. The ink had bled through the parchment, but the name was clear. Aldrich. The note summoned him to a nearby village. A hanging had gone wrong. The village was less than a day's ride. He packed only what he needed, wrapped his blade in cloth, and set out before noon. The fog hung low, curling around the trees like ghosts refusing to leave. The road narrowed as he traveled, turning to gravel, then to mud. His horse snorted uneasily with each step. The air grew heavier the closer he came. When he arrived, a crowd had gathered around the village square. A gallows stood at the center, crude and uneven, with splintering beams and a rope that swayed in the breeze. A man hung from it, or rather should have. His feet touched the ground, his body slumped, his neck not broken. He wheezed with each breath, too weak to speak but too alive to die. Villagers stood frozen in a ring around him, horrified and confused. The local blacksmith had been the one to pull the lever. But the knot had slipped, the trapdoor had stuck, and now the condemned man lingered in a place between justice and cruelty. Aldrich dismounted and walked through the crowd without a word. They parted for him like water. He examined the rope, the knot, the wood. It had all been done carelessly, without precision. The man had been sentenced, yes, but what had followed was torture, not execution. With practiced movements, Aldrich loosened the rope and guided the man to the ground. He drew his blade. The the same he had carried for years, and ended it cleanly.
No spectacle. No ceremony.
Just silence. Then he turned to the villagers and spoke only once. Do not build what you do not understand. He left without accepting payment. The ride back was quiet, but something had changed. The boy's face stayed in his mind. Not the man who died, but the boy who had delivered the message. Eyes too old for such a young face, as if he had already seen what men were capable of. Aldrich wondered if the boy's father had been on that rope, or perhaps his brother, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps he had only come to witness what waited for him. Later that week, Aldrich sat by the river near his home. The sun was warm for the first time in weeks, and the air smelled of wet grass and pine. He removed his boots, rolled up his trousers, and stepped into the shallows. The cold water bit at his legs. He welcomed the sensation. It reminded him he was still alive. He watched the current for a long time. Leaves floated by. A fish darted under a rock. Somewhere upstream, children laughed. He sat on the bank, letting the sun dry his skin. For a moment, he was not an executioner. He was just a man beside a river. But the moment passed. A letter arrived soon after, sealed in wax, addressed by hand. It came from the city he had left months ago. Inside was a summons, not from the magistrate, not from the court, from a brother he had not seen in 20 years. Henrik. He had not known if his brother still lived. They had parted as boys, shortly after their mother's death. Henrik had fled the legacy. He had chosen a different path, one free from axes and ropes, or so Aldrich believed. The letter was short. Henrik was dying. He wanted to see Aldrich.
No explanations. No apologies.
Just a name, a town, and a plea. Aldrich hesitated for days. Then he went. The road was longer this time, through forests that whispered in forgotten tongues, over hills that stretched like sleeping beasts. When he arrived, the town was small, quiet, and untouched by the burdens he carried. He found Henrik in a modest house near the church, pale, thin, eye-sunken but alert. He smiled when he saw Aldrich, a frail, hesitant smile. They spoke little. There was no need. Years had passed, but the silence between them had remained intact. Henrik asked if he still carried it. Aldrich nodded. Henrik asked if he regretted it. Aldrich said nothing. Henrik died 3 days later, peacefully, in sleep. At the funeral, no one recognized Aldrich. He stood at the back of the small chapel, hood drawn, hands folded. The priest spoke of redemption, of forgiveness, of the soul's journey beyond the veil. But Aldrich only heard the sound of dirt hitting wood. He returned to the village by the river with more questions than when he left. How long could he do this? How many lives could he end before his own no longer mattered? The next month brought storms. The river swelled, flooding the lower fields. The villagers stayed inside. Fires crackled in hearths. Aldrich remained alone. The list of condemned grew shorter, then grew again. The wheel turned. People stole, killed, betrayed. Justice was demanded, and he was called. But one day he found himself unable to move. He sat before the blade, unmoving, as rain pelted the windows. He thought of Henrik, of the boy by the river, of his father, of the rope that had not done its job, of the man still half alive on the gallows, of the eyes that watched him everywhere through time and memory. He stood, slowly, and for the first time he placed the blade into a chest. He locked it. Then he walked to the door, stepped outside, and let the storm soak him. He did not care. He would do one more, one final name, and then he would disappear. Chapter 5: The Final Axe Falls. The sun rose without warmth that morning, a pale disk behind a shroud of mist. Aldrich had not slept. He had sat in his chair all night, staring at the chest that held his blade. A single key lay on the table beside him, its metal cold no matter how long he held it. Outside, the frost clung to the grass and windows, whispering the arrival of winter. He knew, as surely as he knew the feel of steel in his palm, that this would be the last name. One more sentence, one more life, then the axe would be buried. Perhaps not physically, but deeply enough that no hand would ever lift it again. The letter had arrived a week ago. It bore the seal of the crown, pressed into crimson wax. Not the seal of the local magistrate or even the regional court. This had come from the capital itself. The parchment was thick, the ink formal and deliberate. It named the condemned, a nobleman, accused of treason and witchcraft, a man who had once served in the king's council and now stood accused of plotting the king's death. It was not the crime that unsettled Aldrich. It was the signature at the bottom. It was the name of the king himself. He had never been summoned by the king directly, not in all his years, not even for the executions of lords or generals. Always the sentence passed through layers of court, bureaucracy, parchment. But not this. This had bypassed the system. A personal call for death, signed with a trembling flourish and sealed in royal blood. Aldrich lit a fire and stared into it. His hands no longer shook. They had learned not to, but his mind raced with questions. Why him? Why now? Why did the king want this man executed by an old village headsman, living in a stone cottage beside a river no one visited? He gathered his things slowly. He did not rush. There was no haste in his movements anymore, only weight. He placed the key in the lock and opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the axe. Its edge gleamed despite the years. He ran his fingers along the handle, remembering each notch, each splinter, each time it had sung through the air. He wrapped it again and tied it tight. The journey to the capital took 4 days. Through valleys dusted with snow, through forests that stood bare and brittle in the wind, through towns where no one met his eyes. He no longer needed to introduce himself. His presence did the speaking. A man traveling with a single bundle wrapped in cloth, dressed in black, quiet and alone. Everyone understood. When he reached the city gates, he expected questioning. Instead, they opened at his arrival. Guards stepped aside. One of them, barely more than a boy, watched him with wide, hollow eyes. Aldrich wondered how long that expression would stay with him. A day? A year? Forever? The palace loomed above the city like a frozen wave. Its stone walls shimmered with ice. Flags snapped in the wind. Inside, everything was still. Cold corridors, marble halls, guards in silver, servants who moved like whispers. A steward led him through the great hall, past tapestries that told stories older than his craft. They reached a chamber smaller than he expected. A fire burned low. The king sat by the window, staring into the snow-covered gardens below. He was thinner than Aldrich remembered, older, eyes rimmed with red, a blanket draped over his lap. He did not turn when Aldrich entered. Instead, he spoke softly. "It must be done at sunrise." Aldrich nodded. The steward handed him the writ. The execution would be public. Not in the square, but in the courtyard below the royal chapel. A return to ceremony, to spectacle. It would be a message. The condemned was being held in the tower. Aldrich asked no questions. He was shown to his quarters, a small room with a narrow bed and a basin of cold water. He sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the muffled noises of the palace. Voices behind doors, the occasional footstep, nothing more. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He waited. At dawn he rose. The sky was the color of iron. He dressed in his black robes, the ones he had not worn in years. The fabric felt heavier now, not with weight but with memory. He unwrapped the axe. It still gleamed. A servant brought him gloves, leather, lined with fur. He declined them. He made his way to the chapel courtyard. A crowd had gathered. Nobles in furs, priests in white, soldiers in perfect lines. The common people watched from behind a gate, faces pale and distant. A hush fell over them as he approached. The scaffold had been raised overnight. Clean wood, a single block at its center. A platform just high enough to be seen from the far side of the wall. A priest stood at the corner, muttering prayers into the wind. The condemned was brought forward. He was older than Aldrich expected, thin, with hair like silver wire and eyes like glass. He did not struggle, did not speak. He walked with dignity, his steps slow but steady. As the man knelt before the block, Aldrich looked into his face. There was no fear, only a strange calm, a kind of acceptance Aldrich rarely saw. The man closed his eyes and waited. The wind stirred. Aldrich stepped forward. The axe rose and fell. It was done in one stroke. There was no cry from the crowd, only silence, deep and echoing, a silence that stretched across the courtyard like a blanket of snow. The body was taken away. The priest continued his prayer. The king watched from the balcony above, face expressionless. Aldrich did not look up. He cleaned the blade with a cloth and wrapped it again. No one stopped him as he left the palace. He returned to his horse and began the journey home. The snow fell heavier that afternoon. It clung to his cloak and lashes. The road was slick, the wind cruel, but he pressed on. He did not look back. He would not return to the capital. Not again. When he reached the village, night had already fallen. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lights flickered behind shuttered windows. He walked past them all, silent and unseen. At his cottage he entered, unwrapped the axe one final time, and stared at it. Then he walked to the river. The water had begun to freeze along the edges. The current still moved beneath, slow and heavy. He stood at the bank for a long time, holding the axe by its handle. He remembered the first time he had held it. He remembered his father's hands, his brother's face, the boy who had delivered the note, the man gasping at the end of the failed rope. He remembered them all. Then, without ceremony, he cast the axe into the river. It struck the surface with a dull splash, vanished beneath, and did not rise again. He watched the ripples fade. The current took it, He turned and walked back to his cottage. Inside, he lit a fire and sat by it. The warmth crept into his bones slowly. His hands rested on his knees. The chest was empty now. The key still sat on the table. He would never open that box again. Days passed, then weeks. He began to walk more. Into the hills, along the river, through the woods. He spoke to no one, but the villagers noticed. The executioner no longer carried the weight of his role. His shoulders eased. His steps lightened. Some still avoided him, but others nodded. One child waved. He did not return to the gallows. He did not answer letters from the court. Eventually they stopped coming. Winter passed. Spring crept in. The river swelled again, but the axe did not rise. One morning, Aldrich found himself by a grove of trees where birds had begun to nest. He sat on a rock and watched them. A robin fed its young. A squirrel darted up a branch. The world moved on, indifferent to what he had done, to what he had been. He closed his eyes. He did not hear the scream of a crowd. He did not smell blood. He heard only the wind and the birds. Years later, a new executioner would be appointed in the capital. A man trained in silence, brought up from the southern provinces. He would never meet Aldrich. He would only hear stories, whispers of the man who walked away, who laid down the axe and never took it up again. Some would say he died alone. Others would say he found peace. But only the river knew the truth. It held his blade and his burden, and it kept them both deep beneath its quiet surface, where no hand could ever reach again. Chapter 6. The Inheritance of Blood. In the quiet of the chapel, a boy sat with his legs swinging over the edge of a wooden pew. His name was Tomas, and he was the son of the blacksmith, or so everyone said. His hair was too dark, though, and his silence too heavy for a boy of only 11. The other children played in the dirt or chased geese through the alleyways. But Tomas always lingered where the shadows were longer and the stone walls colder. He watched things but never asked questions. The village priest had grown used to his presence. At first, he tried to engage him in lessons about saints and psalms. But the boy would only nod and sit still as if waiting for something. Eventually, the priest gave up. Tomas was no trouble, and in a world full of troublemakers, that was a mercy. No one ever noticed when Tomas slipped away. No one followed him when he wandered into the woods beyond the village. He knew every twisted root and every leaning tree. But there was one place he returned to more than any other. A crumbling stone cottage by the river, nearly swallowed by vines and moss. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the roof sagged in the middle like a tired back. Still, the boy went there. Inside, there was a table, a fireplace long cold, and an old wooden chest with a broken lock. He would sit in that cottage for hours, tracing his fingers across the grain of the wood, staring at the hearth as though it still held warmth. Sometimes he would speak aloud, though no one was there to hear. His voice was quiet, dry like autumn leaves, but steady. One day, a traveling merchant passed through the village and saw Tomas by the well. He stopped his cart, tilted his head, and muttered under his breath. When asked what he was staring at, he said the boy looked like someone he had seen before, someone long dead. The merchant left that same day earlier than planned. That evening, Tomas returned to the cottage. He sat by the window and watched the river through the trees. The same river that had once taken something away. The same river that whispered secrets only he seemed to hear. As the sky darkened, he lit a small candle and opened the chest. Inside was nothing. It had been emptied long ago. But he didn't open it for what was inside. He opened it to remember. No one had told him, not outright, but he had pieced it together. From the priest's silence, from the glances of the villagers, from the stories that no one quite finished. There had once been an executioner who lived in that house. Quiet man. A man who walked alone and rarely smiled. Some said he had died in the hills. Others said he vanished into the forest. But the boy knew better. He had the man's eyes. He had the man's silence. And he had the man's hands. Rough, steady, made for holding weight. Years passed.
Thomas grew tired.
Stronger, still silent. When he turned 15, the priest gave him a book. It was worn and half-legible, but inside were drawings. Diagrams of anatomy, muscles, arteries, tendons. It was not the kind of book a priest should have owned. It had come from somewhere else. A gift, perhaps, or a burden passed on. The boy studied it, not with fascination, but with purpose. He began to work in the blacksmith's forge, though not for coin. He wanted to learn how heat shaped metal, how edges could be sharpened, how weight could be balanced. He asked no questions. He only observed. The blacksmith, a gruff man with no family of his own, allowed it. Perhaps he saw something in the boy. Perhaps he didn't want to be alone. Then came the pestilence. A fever swept through the villages like wildfire through dry grass. People died quickly. First the children, then the elderly, then the strong. The blacksmith was among them. The church bells rang too often, and the gravedigger could not keep up. In desperation, the townspeople turned to the Lord for aid. But the Lord had locked his gates and posted guards. He would not risk infection. He would not spare his food. The people starved. They froze. They wept in the snow and cursed the name of the man who once took their grain in taxes and now offered nothing in return. Then someone broke into the granary. The thief was caught. He was dragged before the village square, beaten, tied to a post, and declared a traitor to the realm. A soldier from the manor read the sentence. Death by execution, swift and public. A warning, but there was no one to carry it out. No executioner. No one had worn that role since the man by the river vanished years ago. The soldier hesitated. He could swing a sword in battle, but he would not do this. None of the villagers stepped forward. Not the butcher, not the miller, not even the town reeve. Then the boy stepped forward. He said nothing. He only picked up the axe that had been laid beside the post. No one asked how he knew to lift it the way he did, how he positioned the man, how he held the blade with both hands, feet apart, elbows bent, how he brought it down cleanly, without hesitation, without cruelty. The body slumped forward. The villagers fell silent. The soldier did not thank him. He only nodded and left. The boy placed the axe on the ground and walked away. From that day forward, they called him something else. They called him by a title, not Thomas, but the executioner. He did not correct them. Over time, the pestilence faded. Life returned. The snow melted. Fields were sown again. But Thomas changed. He did not play. He did not dance during festivals. He watched and waited, because where there were people there would be judgment, and where there was judgment there would be blood. A new lord arrived, one who promised to restore order. He had a sharp beard and a sharper temper. He brought coin to the market and order to the streets. But he also brought punishments, harsh ones, swift ones, and he needed someone to carry them out. He summoned Tomas. The boy, now a man, stood in the hall of the manor and said nothing. The Lord told him he would be paid. Federal protected. Tomas did not reply. He only accepted. He was given a house by the wall, a small one with a stable for his horse and a cellar for his tools. The villagers never came near it. They would look at him, nod politely, but never linger. Parents pulled children indoors when he passed. Dogs did not bark at him. Even the drunkards at the tavern lowered their voices when he entered. He performed his duties with precision. Not joy, not hatred, just precision. The gallows stood in the town square again. Ropes were measured. Blocks were cleaned. Axes were sharpened. The routines returned, as if they had never left. And Tomas became part of the landscape, a figure at the edge of every sentence, a shadow at the end of every trial. But it weighed on him. Not in the way it had weighed on his predecessor, not in guilt or grief, but in the knowledge that the world would never let him stop. He would never grow old behind a plow, never marry the baker's daughter, never laugh in the orchard. He would always be what they had made him, a tool, a sentence carved in flesh. One day, an old woman approached him as he stood by the well. Her hands trembled, and her eyes were dim with age, but her voice was clear. She told him she had known his father, the one before him, the man in the woods. She said he had once saved a boy from drowning in the river, that he had brought him to her door and left without a word, and that boy had been him. Tomas did not speak. He only nodded. That night he returned to the cottage. The vines had grown thicker. The door had fallen from its hinges, but the hearth was still there. He sat beside it and lit a fire for the first time in years. He reached into the hollow behind the chimney, the place no one had ever searched, and he found it, not the axe. That was gone, but a book, worn, fragile. Inside were names, dates, notes in a steady hand, records of every judgment, every execution, each written with care, not as trophies, but as burdens. Tomas read them all. He read until the fire burned low and the dawn crept over the trees. Then he closed the book, stood, and walked into the river, not to die, but to cleanse, to stand in the same water that had taken the axe, that had whispered its truths, that had held the blood of the past. And as the current wrapped around his legs, he made a decision. He would not be a tool. He would be the last. He would not train another, would not pass down the robe or the blade. When the time came, he would vanish, and let the silence swallow the name. Let the memory of the executioner fade with the mist. And maybe, just maybe, the village would forget. Forget what it asked of its sons. Forget the weight it placed on their shoulders. And begin again, with no gallows.
No scaffold. No axe.
Only peace. Only silence. Only life. Chapter 7. A job that refused to die. The morning frost clung to the grass like dust on a forgotten altar. It was the kind of cold that sat in the bones and refused to leave, even with a roaring fire. In the village of Rye Moor, the bells tolled for the first time in months, not for a wedding or a market day, but for a sentencing. The crowd gathered slowly, cloaked and silent. Snowflakes drifted from the sky in lazy spirals. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, not yet old enough to understand what was coming, but old enough to sense it was something heavy, something final. A wooden platform had been built near the well. The ropes were new, the beam fresh cut. Everything looked too clean, too crisp, as though justice itself were still trying to convince the village it had a future. But something was missing: the executioner. For years, the village had relied on a man from the northern hills. He traveled by horseback, arrived without a word, did his grim duty, and disappeared before nightfall. No one knew his name. No one asked. He never failed to show. Until now, the condemned man stood alone, shackled and trembling. A thief, they said, a murderer. But others whispered his only real crime was knowing something he shouldn't have. In the end, it didn't matter. The sentence had been passed, and now someone had to carry it out. The Lord's Reeve stepped forward and called for a volunteer. No one moved. Not the carpenter, not the butcher, not the blacksmith's apprentice who could lift a barrel with one arm. No one wanted the stain. No one wanted the silence that followed the strike. Then a stranger stepped forward. He was young, barely 20, with hair too long and hands too clean. He wore no crest, no symbol, no armor. Just a traveler's cloak and boots still dusted with snow from far away. He asked no questions. He only approached the scaffold, examined the axe laid beside the block, and nodded. The Reeve hesitated, but time was pressing. The sentence had to be carried out before sundown. That was the law. The stranger climbed the steps. He spoke softly to the condemned. Too softly for the crowd to hear. The man nodded, closed his eyes. A moment later, the axe fell. The crowd flinched. A few turned away. The stranger cleaned the blade, returned it to its resting place, and walked off the platform. He didn't ask for coin. He didn't stay for supper. He disappeared into the fog. But he had done something dangerous. He had filled a roll, and once a roll was filled, it had a way of sticking. In the days that followed, word of the stranger spread like wildfire. The quiet traveler with the steady hand. The boy executioner. No one knew where he had come from or why he had stepped forward when others did not. But the village remembered, and so did the Reeve. It wasn't long before another sentence was passed. Poacher this time. Caught snaring the Lord's deer. The gallows were readied. The messenger sent. And to the village's astonishment, the stranger returned. He looked the same. Same boots. Same cloak. Same silence. This time he stayed for the night. He rented a room above the stables and sat alone at the hearth while others drank and played dice. He kept to himself, eyes fixed on the fire. When asked his name, he said nothing. When pressed, he simply stood and left. But he always returned when called. Always did what others would not. They gave him a name, of course. Not his real one. Just something easier to whisper. The Hood, because he wore a deep cowl and because no one knew what lay beneath. At first, his presence unsettled people. Children were told to avoid him. Dogs growled when he passed. But over time, something stranger happened. The village grew used to him. He became part of the scenery, like the bell tower, like the frost. People began leaving bread on his doorstep, quiet gestures of gratitude, a new set of gloves, a whetstone wrapped in linen. No one said anything, but the offerings kept coming. What no one knew was that the stranger had once been a monk. He had studied in a scriptorium far to the east, where the wind howled over ruins and ink froze in the bottle. He had copied the words of saints by candlelight, memorized the lessons of mercy and judgment, and believed, truly believed, that his hands were meant for scripture. Until the fire. The abbey had burned in the night. Some said it was lightning. Others blamed raiders. In the smoke and confusion, he had pulled 3 brothers from the flames. The 4th he could not save. That 4th had been his teacher, his guide, the man who had once told him that silence was a form of prayer. After the fire, he wandered. He wore no robe, no cross, only the silence, and it followed him, until Rymor, until the axe. What tormented him most wasn't the act itself. It was how steady his hands had been, how easily he had done it, how the crowd had watched him not with horror, but with relief, as though he had removed a burden from them all, as though, in doing something terrible, he had somehow given them permission to feel safe again. That was the poison of the job. It never felt like murder, felt like service, which made it all the more unbearable. Over the next year, 5 more executions were called. Each time he answered. Each time he performed it without cruelty, without flourish. Just precision, just silence, until the 6th. The 6th was different. It was a girl, no older than 17, accused of witchcraft, caught with herbs in her skirt and strange markings on her wrist. The villagers wanted blood. They spoke of sickness and famine and goats that would not give milk. The old fears rose again like ghosts from the ground. The stranger arrived, as he always did. But something shifted in his eyes. He examined the girl, saw the bruises on her arms, the burns on her palms. He asked no questions, but for the first time, he lingered by the jail longer than necessary. That night he entered the chapel. The priest recognized him, not by face but by bearing. Something in the way he knelt, in the way he bowed his head before the altar. They spoke in hushed tones. Only the stone walls heard them. And the next morning the gallows were empty. The girl had vanished. So had the stranger. The villagers searched the woods for days, but found nothing. The reeve posted a reward. Still nothing. Then a note appeared on the chapel door. It was nailed to the wood with a black iron pin. No signature, no seal. It said only this: no more blood. The gallows were torn down a week later. No one wanted to be the next to build them again. Years passed. Stories spread. Tales of a hooded man in the woods. A ghost executioner who spared the innocent and punished the corrupt. Bandits who vanished in the night. Lords who woke to find a blade driven through their coat of arms, but never their hearts. Some said he had died. Some said he had become something more than a man, a legend. But the truth was simpler. He had walked away, because the job never ended, because the people would always find someone to blame, and someone to swing the axe. It wasn't just a job. It was a curse that traveled by blood, by need, by fear. The real horror of being a medieval executioner wasn't just in what you did. It was in how quickly people learned to depend on you, how quickly they grew comfortable with what you represented, How easily they handed you the blade and asked you to make their problems disappear. And how impossible it was to live a life afterward. A life without stares, without whispers, without guilt. There was no pension, no peace, only silence, only the echo of the axe, and the knowledge that somewhere, in some village, the bell would toll again, and someone would step forward, because the job, cursed though it was, refused to die, and someone, somewhere, would always be willing to carry the weight others could not bear, even if it broke them, even if it erased them, even if, by the end, all that remained of them was a hood, and a name no one remembered.